Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about something that affects every aspect of your personal and professional life: how to succeed at hard conversations. These are the conversations that make your palms sweat, raise your heart rate, and often keep you up at night. Whether it's negotiating with a colleague, confronting a friend, setting boundaries with family, or giving feedback at work, these situations are wired into your nervous system as threats. But the truth is, difficult conversations are not just emotional challenges, they are neurobiological events. And when you understand what's happening in your brain and body, you can actually train for them and succeed. Today, I'll walk you through 5 science-based signs that indicate you're prepared and primed to navigate these situations effectively. One of the first and most powerful signs that someone is prepared to navigate a hard conversation is their ability to maintain eye contact without becoming overwhelmed. This may seem like a small behavioral detail, but in truth, it reveals a deep level of nervous system regulation and a powerful lever for success in any high-stakes dialogue. To understand why, we need to look at the relationship between eye contact and the autonomic nervous system, the branch of the nervous system responsible for regulating things like heart rate, breathing, digestion, and, critically, our stress response. When a person enters a difficult or emotionally loaded conversation, their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes more active. This ancient part of the brain is designed to detect signs of social rejection, confrontation, or danger. And it does so very quickly. In just milliseconds, it can trigger a cascade of physiological responses. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, palms may sweat, and most notably, eye contact often breaks. Why does this happen? Because eye contact is inherently intimate. It signals connection, presence, and vulnerability. But under perceived threat, our natural response is often to look away, which gives the brain a brief moment of escape, both physically and psychologically. In this way, avoiding eye contact becomes a strategy of self-protection. But the inverse is also true. Being able to hold calm, steady eye contact, not a stare down, but a relaxed, grounded gaze, is a signal that the prefrontal cortex is still in control. This part of the brain is responsible for executive functions like decision-making, emotional regulation, and empathy. When the prefrontal cortex is active and engaged during a tough conversation, it sends inhibitory signals to the amygdala, essentially calming the brain's internal alarm system. In practical terms, this means that maintaining eye contact, without becoming agitated or avoidant, tells us that a person is not being hijacked by stress, but is instead navigating the conversation with clarity and control. It's a behavioral signal that the body's sympathetic nervous system, which governs fight or flight, is balanced by the parasympathetic system, which governs rest and regulation. This balance is the sweet spot for communication, where you can be fully present, responsive, and emotionally intelligent. There are even more layers to this. Neuroscientific research has shown that eye contact activates the social brain, areas like the superior temporal sulcus, fusiform face area, and anterior cingulate cortex, which are involved in reading emotional expressions, processing tone of voice, and interpreting intent. These circuits are crucial in conflict resolution, because they help us detect the subtle, non-verbal cues that signal whether the other person feels heard, respected, or threatened. This is particularly important when what's being said is emotionally charged. Eye contact in these moments serves as a non-verbal regulator. It can either escalate or de-escalate tension. A calm gaze can convey, "I'm with you, even though this is hard," while looking away might unintentionally communicate avoidance, fear, or defensiveness. So how can someone train for this? One powerful practice is visual anchoring combined with breath work. Before entering a difficult conversation, take 1 to 2 minutes to engage in diaphragmatic breathing, slow inhalations through the nose, with longer exhalations through the mouth. At the same time, focus your eyes softly on a single point in the room. This trains the parasympathetic tone of your nervous system while reinforcing your ability to maintain visual stability. You can also use a technique called visual tethering. During the conversation, allow yourself to briefly look at the bridge of the other person's nose or between the eyebrows if direct eye contact feels too intense. This still registers as engagement without overstimulating your own system. Over time, this skill becomes reflexive. You become the kind of person who can sit in emotional discomfort, with full presence, with clear eyes, and without losing control of your own internal state. That's not just emotional intelligence, it's neurobiological mastery. In short, the ability to maintain regulated eye contact during a hard conversation is not about dominance or performance. It's about embodied safety. It shows that your brain and body are working in harmony, allowing you to stay open, clear, and connected even under stress. And that's exactly the state from which real communication, and real resolution, begins. In high-stakes or emotionally charged conversations, what often makes the greatest impact isn't how well we speak, it's how well we listen. But true listening isn't as simple as remaining silent while the other person talks. From a neurobiological perspective, listening is an active process that demands engagement from several key brain systems responsible for empathy, attention, and regulation. And the quality of that listening determines the direction and outcome of the conversation. When we're in the midst of a difficult discussion, especially one involving disagreement or emotional intensity, our internal narrative tends to become louder than the person speaking. The brain begins to prepare its response while the other person is still talking. This is a natural defense strategy. The mind is trying to reduce uncertainty and protect its own sense of correctness. But in doing so, it pulls attention away from the speaker and places it inward, into our own assumptions, interpretations, and counterarguments. Neuroscientifically, this is a shift in network dominance. When we're self-focused, especially during conflict, the dorsal attention network and salience network become more active. These systems help us detect threat and relevance. They light up when we hear something we disagree with, when we feel attacked, or when something triggers a memory of past hurt. As these networks become active, the default mode network, which supports empathy, imagination, and the ability to model another person's emotional state, becomes less dominant. In other words, when we're preparing our rebuttal, we're not listening with empathy. We're listening with defense. But the human brain can't do both with full fidelity. It can't simultaneously prepare a counterattack and deeply absorb another person's emotional content. To listen fully, we need to pause our own internal monologue and shift our attention outward. That shift recruits the default mode network and other parts of the brain like the temporoparietal junction, medial prefrontal cortex, and anterior insula, all of which are involved in perspective taking and emotional resonance. The result of activating these systems is not just deeper comprehension, it's also emotional regulation. By focusing on the other person, rather than on defending our ego, we can actually reduce the activity in our amygdala and lower our physiological stress. Listening, when done well, becomes a self-calming act, one that benefits both people involved. It also creates what neuroscientists call shared intentionality, a state in which two people begin to align their understanding, timing, and emotional rhythm. This leads to increased synchrony in neural oscillations between speaker and listener, an effect observed in fMRI and EEG studies. In simpler terms, when we truly listen, our brains begin to synchronize with the person we're listening to. That synchronization fosters trust, safety, and openness, the key ingredients for productive and honest dialogue. One of the most effective tools for cultivating active listening is to use a deliberate pause before speaking. When someone finishes talking, wait for one full breath, inhale and exhale, before responding. This moment of silence not only gives your brain space to process what was said, but also signals to the other person that you're not reacting, you're considering. Following this, reflect back what you heard. Not word for word, but in essence. For example, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated because your concerns haven't been acknowledged. This act of summarizing, or mirroring, activates social cognition networks in both your brain and theirs. It's not just about being polite. It actually deepens the neural circuitry that allows for trust and cooperation. This also gives you time to assess your own emotional state. Were you triggered by something they said? Are you starting to feel defensive? Acknowledge it internally. Labeling the emotion, even silently, engages the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which helps reduce limbic reactivity. In short, naming what you're feeling helps calm it down. This creates the internal space to remain present and attuned. Active listening is a practice, and like any practice, it requires repetition. Over time, the brain becomes better at shifting away from internal defensiveness and toward external attunement. And as this shift happens more consistently, conversations begin to change. They become less about winning or losing and more about understanding and moving forward. In a world where attention is fragmented and speed is glorified, slowing down to truly listen becomes a powerful neurological intervention. It transforms the nervous system from one of threat detection to one of connection. And in doing so, it sets the stage for difficult conversations to become not just bearable, but meaningful. Many people enter difficult conversations with the assumption that they need to be perfectly calm in order to succeed. But that's not necessarily true, and in fact, being too calm can sometimes signal disengagement or emotional detachment. The key isn't eliminating stress altogether, it's learning to operate within a zone of controlled activation, where the body and brain are alert, but not overwhelmed. To understand this more deeply, we can turn to a foundational principle in performance psychology and neuroscience known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. This law describes a bell-shaped curve that links arousal, or physiological activation, to performance. At very low levels of arousal, performance tends to be poor. We're bored, distracted, or unengaged. As arousal increases, so does performance, up to a point. Beyond that point, further increases in arousal lead to stress, anxiety, and eventually, performance breakdown. In the context of a hard conversation, this means that some level of physiological stress, elevated heart rate, increased alertness, even a bit of adrenaline, can be beneficial. These signals indicate that your brain is paying attention, that you care about the outcome, and that your system is preparing to respond. But if these signals become too intense, they begin to impair function. You lose access to executive thinking, emotional control, and verbal fluency, the very tools you need most. The key, then, is not to suppress stress, but to learn how to ride the wave, keeping it high enough to stay sharp, but low enough to stay regulated. One of the most immediate signs that you're within this optimal zone is that you're aware of your elevated state. Maybe you feel your pulse increase or your breathing change, but you're still able to think clearly. You can formulate sentences. You can choose your words instead of blurting them out. You might even be aware of multiple perspectives at once, what you're feeling, what the other person might be feeling, and what the conversation needs in that moment. That level of multi-layered awareness is only possible when the prefrontal cortex remains online, which it doesn't if stress surpasses the optimal threshold. In practical terms, maintaining this balance involves managing the body first, because the body sets the tone for the mind. One of the fastest ways to do this is through a tool known as the physiological sigh, a pattern of breathing that involves taking 2 quick inhales through the nose, followed by a long exhale through the mouth. This technique mimics the body's natural sighing reflex, which occurs spontaneously when we release tension. Neuroscientific studies have shown that the physiological sigh reduces carbon dioxide buildup in the bloodstream and sends a calming signal via the vagus nerve to the heart and lungs, helping to reduce heart rate and restore balance. This can be done in real time during a hard conversation, discreetly and without disrupting the flow. Inhaling once fully, then topping off with a second short inhale, and slowly exhaling can take as little as 10 seconds, but has profound effects on the brain-body system. It restores access to higher cognitive function, allowing you to remain present, strategic, and emotionally regulated. Another important factor in maintaining cognitive clarity during stress is interoception, the ability to sense your internal bodily states. This includes being aware of your heartbeat, muscle tension, or the sensation of heat rising in your chest. People who are trained in interoceptive awareness are more likely to detect when they are nearing the edge of their stress capacity, and can take action before they cross that threshold. Training this ability doesn't require formal meditation, though that can help. It simply means checking in with your body periodically. Ask yourself, is my jaw clenched? Am I breathing through my mouth or nose? Is my stomach tight? These small moments of self-awareness build a loop between body and brain that enhances emotional intelligence and self-control. Finally, it's worth noting that moderate stress heightens memory encoding. This is important because hard conversations often involve the exchange of emotionally significant information, things that can reshape relationships, alter work dynamics, or set long-term boundaries. If you're in the optimal arousal zone, your brain is more likely to encode those moments accurately, which improves your ability to reflect on them later and integrate what you learned. In summary, success in hard conversations doesn't come from avoiding stress, it comes from learning to navigate stress skillfully. A slightly elevated heart rate, sharper focus, a stronger sense of presence, these are not signs of failure. They are signs that your body is mobilizing for something important. When you recognize that and pair it with self-regulation tools, you turn stress into fuel. Not something to fear, but something to channel. In the moments when a conversation becomes difficult, emotionally charged, or deeply personal, the brain instinctively tries to simplify the situation into one of 2 categories: right or wrong, safe or unsafe, us or them. This binary simplification is a survival response. It emerges from deep within the limbic system, particularly the amygdala and insular cortex, areas designed to rapidly assess threat and generate protective behavior. But meaningful dialogue rarely fits into binary categories. In reality, most hard conversations are built on multiple layers of perception, different life experiences, emotional filters, timing, and needs. The ability to tolerate and even embrace this complexity is a defining feature of mature communication. It requires a specific kind of cognitive and emotional strength, the capacity to hold two or more perspectives at once without rushing to resolution. Neurologically, this skill involves increased activity and connectivity within the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function, perspective taking, and inhibitory control. This part of the brain allows us to pause, reflect, and reframe, rather than react. It also enables what's called cognitive flexibility, the ability to consider different viewpoints, tolerate ambiguity, and delay judgment. These capacities are essential for high-level decision-making and social interaction. When we engage in a tough conversation and feel the urge to immediately fix, defend, or resolve something, that's often a signal that our nervous system is becoming dysregulated. It's not just psychological discomfort, it's physiological. The sympathetic nervous system becomes activated, pushing us toward premature closure because uncertainty feels like danger. We want answers now, clarity now, relief now. But the paradox is that effective communication, especially when emotions are involved, often requires sitting with uncertainty a little longer than is comfortable. It means staying present while the outcome is unclear, while both sides express pain, or while opposing truths coexist in the same space. For example, in a conflict between two people, one may say, "I felt completely abandoned when you didn't check in," while the other may genuinely believe, "I was giving you space because I thought that's what you needed." Both statements can be true. They are not mutually exclusive, they are simply rooted in different assumptions and emotional contexts. The skill lies in being able to validate the other person's truth without invalidating your own. And that's a neurologically demanding process. The anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, plays a key role here. It's involved in conflict monitoring, not just in detecting contradiction, but in holding opposing thoughts or emotions simultaneously without needing immediate resolution. When the ACC is well integrated with the prefrontal cortex, it becomes easier to say things like, "I hear what you're saying, and here's how I've experienced it," rather than defaulting to, "That's not what happened," or "You're wrong." Another related mechanism is emotional labeling, which supports regulation. When we can internally acknowledge, "This feels tense, I'm getting defensive, but I want to stay open," we engage the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which helps downregulate limbic reactivity. In short, naming our internal state allows us to keep it from hijacking the interaction. There are practical tools for cultivating this tolerance for duality. One is called metacognitive looping, a simple practice of asking yourself during a conversation, "What else could be true here?" This question, repeated silently in the mind, pulls attention away from defensive certainty and reorients it toward curiosity. That subtle shift recruits brain regions associated with empathy, abstract reasoning, and cooperation. Another tool is to use language that explicitly acknowledges complexity. Phrases like, "It's possible we're both experiencing this very differently. Let's sit with both perspectives before deciding what needs to happen. I don't have to agree to understand." These statements are not just diplomatic, they're neural regulators. They help both people's nervous systems settle into a state where productive dialogue becomes more likely. Over time, as this skill develops, the brain begins to rewire its tolerance thresholds. What once felt like unbearable contradiction becomes manageable complexity. What once had to be resolved instantly becomes something that can be explored over time. That's where growth occurs, both interpersonally and internally. Ultimately, the ability to hold dual perspectives without collapsing into one is a sign of resilient cognition. It's not about being indecisive or passive. It's about giving the nervous system enough space and safety to process fully, before reacting. And from that space, deeper truths emerge. Not the easy answers, but the honest ones. One of the most overlooked yet critical skills in navigating hard conversations is knowing when to end the exchange. This may sound counterintuitive. After all, aren't we supposed to work things out fully and reach resolution? But neurobiology tells a different story. The human brain, and more specifically the nervous system, has a limited window of tolerance when it comes to emotional load and cognitive effort. And pushing past that threshold, even with good intentions, often leads to dysregulation, breakdowns in communication, and damage to the relationship. From a neurophysiological standpoint, difficult conversations activate multiple systems simultaneously. The limbic system, which governs emotional salience and threat detection, becomes engaged. The prefrontal cortex, which handles executive function, empathy, and language processing, works to stay online in the face of emotional input. At the same time, the autonomic nervous system is trying to regulate heart rate, breathing, and muscle tension. This orchestration is effective only for a limited time, especially under stress. The longer the conversation continues, particularly when it involves disagreement or vulnerability, the more neurochemical resources, like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, get depleted. Fatigue sets in. Emotional reactivity rises. Rational thinking declines. This is the moment when people say things they don't mean, retreat into silence, or become stuck in repetitive loops. Recognizing this moment is key. The ability to end a hard conversation at the right time, even without full resolution, is not a sign of avoidance or failure, it's a sign of self-awareness and emotional intelligence. It shows that the individual has a working relationship with their internal signals: elevated heart rate, rising frustration, mental fog, or repetitive speech patterns. These signals are data. They're indicators that the nervous system is nearing its edge. In neuroscience, there's a term called allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body and brain from prolonged stress. Continuing a difficult conversation past the point of tolerance increases allostatic load and can impair future interactions. But when the conversation is paused with intention, before things break down, the brain encodes the experience as manageable. This builds resilient circuitry over time. There's also a social psychological component to this. When we try to win a conversation, to push until we get agreement or an apology or a declaration of who's right, we subtly shift from connection to control. The other person senses this, often unconsciously. Their defenses go up. Their brain responds as if under social threat, which activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. This makes real resolution even less likely. Instead, ending a conversation well means recognizing that dialogue is a process, not an event. Not everything needs to be solved in one sitting. In fact, true progress often happens between conversations, in the integration period when the brain consolidates insights, reduces emotional charge, and creates new narratives. One effective strategy is to use clear, self-regulated language to end the conversation, such as, "This feels like a good place to pause so we can both reflect. I want to make sure we continue this when we're both resourced and clear. Let's take a break and come back to this with fresh perspective." These statements are not just polite closes, they signal safety to the nervous system. They communicate, "We're not in danger. This conversation matters. And we'll return to it." This allows both people to exit the interaction with dignity and clarity rather than frustration and exhaustion. There's also a neurochemical advantage to ending at the right moment. When conversations are paused while still in a window of safety and connection, the brain releases small amounts of oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and dopamine, the chemical of reward. These create a positive reinforcement loop that makes it more likely both individuals will re-engage in the future, and with more openness. The challenge, of course, is internal. Many people carry unconscious beliefs that ending a conversation early means giving up, or letting the other person win. But this framing is based in ego, not science. From a neurological standpoint, ending the conversation skillfully is winning, because it preserves the relationship, protects brain function, and increases the chance of a constructive future interaction. Over time, this ability becomes a sign of inner stability. You learn to separate urgency from importance, and ego from outcome. You develop the self-trust to say, "This isn't resolved yet, but I don't need to force it." And in doing so, you train your brain to operate from composure instead of compulsion. In the end, difficult conversations are not competitions, they are opportunities for alignment, healing, or redirection. And the person who knows when to pause is the one who is most likely to succeed, not just in that moment, but in every meaningful connection that follows. There's a common misconception that the more experience you have with hard conversations, the less stressful they become. That with repetition, these interactions will somehow stop triggering anxiety, tension, or fear. But from a neurobiological standpoint, that's not exactly how the brain works. The stress of high-stakes communication doesn't disappear. Instead, your capacity to handle it expands. The brain and nervous system don't erase responses to threat, they build tolerance through adaptation. This process is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to repeated experience. It's the reason a beginner at public speaking might feel flooded with adrenaline, shaky hands, and rapid heartbeat, while a seasoned speaker experiences those same responses, but knows how to regulate and harness them to stay sharp and composed. Hard conversations are no different. They continue to activate many of the same biological systems each time. The amygdala detects social threat, the hypothalamus signals to the adrenal glands, cortisol and adrenaline are released, and the sympathetic nervous system gets activated. Your palms might sweat, your throat may tighten, your heart rate increases. These reactions don't disappear, but with training, the prefrontal cortex learns how to interpret and manage them differently. In the early stages of emotional communication, these stress responses often lead to avoidance behaviors, shutting down, deflecting, placating, or escalating. These are not moral failings, they are adaptive responses to discomfort. But the more you engage in these conversations while staying regulated, the more your brain learns that emotional intensity is not inherently dangerous. That's the foundation of emotional resilience, not a lack of reaction, but an increased capacity to respond skillfully. Over time, the repeated exposure to hard dialogue, when combined with self-regulation tools like controlled breathing, cognitive reframing, and body awareness, changes the way your nervous system interprets interpersonal conflict. What was once perceived as threat becomes reclassified as challenge. And this distinction is critical. In neuroscience, the difference between threat and challenge states comes down to how the body prepares. In a threat state, resources are directed toward protection, muscles tense, vision narrows, and cognitive flexibility drops. In a challenge state, the body still activates, but in a way that supports action and focus. Heart rate rises, but so does heart rate variability, which is a sign of balanced autonomic function. You're engaged, not panicked. Training your system to enter a challenge state, rather than a threat state, during emotional conversations is not automatic. It requires deliberate exposure and post-conversation reflection. Every time you get through a hard conversation, even if it's messy, and take time to review what happened, how your body responded, and what helped you stay present, you're laying down stronger neurological pathways for the next time. You're teaching your brain that you can survive emotional risk, and not just survive, but grow from it. An important part of this strengthening process is learning to decouple discomfort from danger. Many people interpret the discomfort of a difficult conversation as a sign that something is wrong. But discomfort is not a red light, it's a sign that something important is happening. In fact, the presence of discomfort is often a reliable signal that the conversation is meaningful. The brain doesn't become desensitized to meaningful things. Instead, it learns how to handle them with more skill, more strategy, and more endurance. There's also a shift in internal narrative that occurs through this process. Early on, you may enter hard conversations with thoughts like, "I hope I don't mess this up," or "I hate confrontation." But as you build capacity, the narrative changes to, "This is going to be hard, and I know I can handle it." That shift isn't just motivational. It's neurologically grounded self-efficacy, the belief that you can exert influence over your environment and your outcomes. Self-efficacy activates circuits in the medial prefrontal cortex, an area associated with confidence, decision-making, and goal pursuit. The stronger these circuits become, the more likely you are to engage in difficult conversations proactively, rather than only when forced to. With time, something remarkable happens. You begin to trust your ability to stay present in emotional discomfort. You learn that you don't need to have all the answers or control the outcome, you just need to stay regulated, stay open, and stay engaged. And that's when you realize that it's not the conversation that became easier, it's you who became more capable. You grew stronger, not because the challenge went away, but because your nervous system adapted. Your brain rewired. Your responses matured. And now, what once felt overwhelming becomes an arena of growth, connection, and even healing. The conversation is still hard. You're just better at it.